The subject today is democracy as a domain for institutional and ideological transformation. Some of what I have to say today involves going back to the discussion we had about the United States and developing it. Now, the theme of democracy has a natural primacy in a project of reconstruction because the organization of politics and of the state sets the terms on which all the other domains of institutional transformation, including the economy, are to be done. But this could produce a misleading impression in the following sense. Thematically, democracy is the most important domain of transformation. But that doesn't mean that the transformation of politics necessarily or ordinarily comes first. A common belief of reformists around the world is that the reform of politics and of the state is the mother of all reforms and has a natural priority. But the truth is that no country reforms its politics and its state in order later to decide what to do with the reformed state or the reformed politics. The reform of politics and the reform of the state takes place only when it needs to take place to allow the country to move. So that's temporally what really has priority is the struggle over the economic and social direction of a society. And then the struggle to reform politics comes place, as it were, second, even though in its significance, one might think it should be first. Now, the starting point for developing a programmatic idea about the direction of the reformation of politics has to be taking a position in two great debates that have commanded our thinking about the reorganization of political life. The first debate is an ideological debate, and the second debate is an institutional debate. The ideological debate can be described in terms that were first set by Benjamin Constant, the Swiss-French political theorist at the start of the 19th century, when he contrasted the freedom of the ancients with the freedom of the moderns. The freedom of the ancients was the freedom attributed to the mythical Spartans or Romans in a form of life in which politics had centrality. Politics was not, on this view, an exceptional activity. It was the center, and it penetrated all domains of life. And they were free, Constant said, because they were the masters of their historical fate, organized through the political struggle in the state. Not necessarily in a consensual or cooperative form. For example, Machiavelli had held that the Roman Republic was united by its conflicts as much as by its agreements. The conflicts between the plebs and the patricians were what gave unity and direction, according to Machiavelli, to the Roman Republic. But this idea of the freedom of the ancients, this image, which many modern political theorists have echoed, is of course a myth. It's not the description of any real society, It's simply a utopian or idealizing inversion of the experience of the privatization of the sublime in modern societies, projecting onto some imaginary ancient society the opposite. The opposite is a society in which politics is not simply an exceptional activity, but the central activity of human existence. And political ambition, political concern, concern for the common good, for the common fate, penetrates every aspect of human existence. This never existed. So this is like an attempt to resolve the problem of politics by a conceptual inversion, an upside-down maneuver. The alternative, according to Constant, is the freedom of the moderns. For the moderns, Constant said, politics is an ecstatic or exceptional activity. The real flesh and bones individual has particular interests, and his orientation is dominated by the pursuit of these real particular interests. And political life then is conducted by a cadre of professional politicians, more or less separated from the general population, who then create a struggle over the direction of the state that is subservient to this class of particular interests in society and doesn't reflect some generalizing ambition for the direction of the whole. Now, some of you may be surprised that in this debate, I take resolutely the position of the freedom of the moderns rather than the freedom of the ancients as the starting point. Because the freedom of the moderns is the only thing that is real, that exists. And it is necessarily the starting point given to us by our history, by our historical experience. But it is the point of departure, not the point of arrival. So the idea is to begin from there, to recognize the primacy of private interests in the menu of human attention, and to proceed from that starting point to a reconstruction. Now, to explain the meaning of this reconstruction, I can revert to an abstract categorization. Remember, I once, earlier in the argument, I contrasted the ordinary moves, that we make within a framework of arrangements and assumptions that we take for granted, and the exceptional moves by which, from time to time, typically under the provocation of crisis, we challenge and change pieces of the framework. And so, reinterpreting what Constant said, Constant saying, in ordinary experience, our lives are dominated by these ordinary moves within the framework, not in the exceptional moves by which we challenge and change pieces of the framework. But the ambition in the progressive reconstruction of political life should be to diminish this contrast over time, to narrow the distance between these two categories of moves, so that the exceptional moves by which we challenge and change pieces of the framework arise more continuously, naturally, or organically from the ordinary moves that we make within the framework, the ordinary business of life, rather than being an exceptional jump out of the historical reality. And that indeed is one of the definitions of freedom, of what I called earlier deep freedom. It's that second domain, To be free, we have to participate in a social world. No one can be free isolated in the forest. But the problem is that every participation in a social world threatens to exact from us, as part of the price of participation, surrender to that world. And then I said, one of the meanings of freedom is that we can participate without surrendering. We can participate denying the last word to that social world and keeping the last word for ourselves. And thus, in a sense, be at the same time insiders and outsiders. For that to happen, the institutions of society, and in particular the political institutions, have to be organized in a way in which they facilitate their own revision in the light of experience. So to find ourselves in a political world is then not to find ourselves imprisoned, but to find ourselves in a world that we can transform, taking as the starting point our ordinary activities. Not just our ordinary political activities, but also our ordinary economic or cultural activities. So the idea is that the starting point ideologically is this freedom of the moderns, of the ordinary flesh and bones individual with real interests that dominate his attention. But that little by little we create a form of historical experience that amplifies this, that diminishes the distance between these private concerns and the concerns with the public. And as a result, the individual is less imprisoned in the political world in which he happens to find himself. So the conception of freedom is then a dynamic or historical conception. It starts with a domination of purely private interests, and it develops into a way of thinking in which the contrast between the private and the public is relativized. So that's, as it were, the first point of departure. To say, in that contrast of the ancient and the modern republics, there's only one possible position to take as the starting point, the freedom of the moderns. Because the other freedom, the freedom of the ancients, is a myth and a mythological statement of a utopian desire. Now, the second starting point is institutional. And it has to do with the remarkable fact of the history of our ideas about political life. The repertoire of arrangements for the organization of the state and for the organization of a democratic state is remarkably narrow. There's a very small list of live options for the organization of democracy in the world. The more we study constitutional history, comparative constitutional history, the more we are astonished by the narrowness of this repertoire. There is an exception to that repertoire. And the exception is what you could call the outer circle. So the inner circle is this narrow history of constitutional orthodoxy with a very small range of variations. The presidential system of the Americans, the parliamentary or semi-parliamentary system of the Europeans, and so forth. The outer circle is the circle of the leftist dissidents. And the theme in that outer circle is the rejection of representative democracy and the assertion of the claims of direct participatory democracy in a particular form, in the form of popular councils, workers' councils, popular councils, or the Soviets, to use the Russian word. So the constitutional ideology of the leftists has refused to enter into the debates of the inner circle, the debates of the evolution of the constitutional orthodoxy, and it has insisted on taking this outer position, which begins with the denial of the claim that representative institutions are necessary in large modern societies, and the assertion of the claim that a democratic political life must be based on the direct self-government of the people, not mediated by representative institutions. Now, what has been the experience with the attempts to implement in modern history this idea? The experience has been an experience of unbroken failure. So, in many revolutions, in many revolutionary moments in modern history, this idea has been affirmed. An attempt has been made to organize these popular councils, including in Russia, in the Russian Revolution. And on every occasion, they have failed. The conciliar form of government has withered after an initial period of enthusiasm and been replaced either by a conventional form of democracy or by the dictatorship of a revolutionary vanguard of a party. That's what happened in the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century, and that's what happened in the revolutions of the 20th century. So once again, there's only one possible starting point. The only possible starting point is to engage the narrow repertoire of constitutional ideas and to expand it, because it's the only thing that's real. The other thing is a feint, is an illusion, is a mirage. So there's a homology between my attitude to these two debates, to the ideological debate, as described by Constant, and to the real debate about alternative institutions. But the attitude is the same, not just in the sense of taking the apparently more conservative position as the starting point, but also in the sense of taking it as only the starting point, as I said before with respect to the other debate, as the point of departure rather than as the point of arrival. Now, from this standpoint, the argument I want to make is that there's the counterpart to the project which we've just examined of democratizing the market order by reorganizing the relation between the vanguard, the productive vanguard, and the rest, by reorganizing the relation between labor and capital to ensure that free labor is really free, and by reorganizing the relation between finance and the real economy to ensure that finance serves the interests of the productive agenda of society rather than serving itself. That agenda has as its counterpart in politics the creation of a different kind of democracy, which I'm going to call high-energy democracy. So the counterpart to the democratization of the market order is the construction, step by step, of a high-energy democracy. All the democracies that exist in the world, to a greater or lesser extent, are weak, flawed democracies in the following sense. By three criteria that I want to use to describe the distinction between these democracies, these existing democracies, and what I'm calling a high-energy democracy. All of them exist in the context of class societies, because all the historical societies and the societies that exist to this day are class societies, in which the individual citizens have differential advantages and opportunities shaped by hereditary transmission of differential opportunity through the family. And the weak democracies all accept this reality of class society in practice, even though, as we shall see, they use various devices by which to resist the dominion of class or to deny the dominion of class. So the first criterion of a high-energy democracy, by contrast to these weak democracies that exist, is that they should be fertile, they should be prodigal in the production of structural changes that subvert the class order. Now, a little bit of history. In the early 19th century, in Europe and in the United States and throughout much of the world, there was resistance to universal suffrage. And the vote was qualified in many ways there were proprietary qualifications. You could only vote if you had a certain amount of property or a certain kind of property, and often as well educational qualifications to the vote. And the universal belief of both conservatives and radicals was that if universal suffrage were instituted, the masses, the popular majority, would use the vote to produce a revolution in the social order. They would simply vote, in effect, to confiscate the wealth of the asset-holding classes. So universal suffrage was universally either desired or feared as an instrument of revolutionary change. Now, we know what happened. What happened is that universal suffrage was instituted, and no such revolutionary change took place. The masses, in principle, could have used the vote to confiscate the privileges of the elites, of the property-holding classes, but they didn't. And they didn't in any society in the world. The most they ever did with the vote was to do what they did under European social democracy, which is to vote to have a high level of social entitlements, paradoxically financed by the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption, as through the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax. In no society was the vote used to do what it seems it would inevitably do, which is to serve as the instrument of radical redistribution. Now, why this did not happen is something of a puzzle, and various explanations are given, the common theme of which is often some kind of ideological or political illusion. The explanation of conservatives, of course, is that the workers, the masses, understood that radical redistribution would be subversive of both economic growth and political freedom. And that's why they hesitated to use the vote for that purpose. So as a result, what we have in the world are either these weak democracies that more or less passively accept the class system, attenuating its effects, especially through compensatory redistribution, by progressive taxation, and by redistributive social spending. And on the other hand, then we have dictatorships, including collective dictatorships managed in the name of a revolutionary idea. So you could say that under the weak democracies, there is a porous and soft state. There's a state that is easily penetrated and captured by the elite interests, by the interests of the asset-holding classes. And the alternative to that soft state, which is the state that exists under these weak democracies, is an authoritarian or dictatorial state in which there is a vanguard that claims to speak for the interests of society and its revolutionary potential. Now, we also know what's happened under this vanguard, under these vanguards, under these party dictatorships. The domination of political party, of political power, is eventually translated into social and economic advantage. And a new class order arises under these revolutionary dictatorships on the basis of the authoritarian political power. And moreover, the despots, the collective despots, are susceptible to the adoption of dogmas about economic growth, for example. So the combination of their epistemic disadvantage, their susceptibility to dogmatism, and their self-interest in the maintenance of power and in the transformation of political power into economic power, and then economic power back again into political power, vitiates the scheme. So that's the alternative with which humanity is now confronted. Either it accepts these weak democracies, these porous states that can be captured by the rich and by the elites, or it appeals to this adventure of the revolutionary despotism with all the disasters that ensue. That's the lamentable history which produces then, or helps account for the narrowness of the constitutional repertoire. Now this helps indicate the background to a very important idea that has emerged in the world with respect to those narrow legal and political institutional ideas. For the liberals of the 19th century, the notion was you have to have this kind of order of right, this kind of legal system, this way of organizing property and so forth, because it's part of the definition of freedom. We are less inclined to believe that, we today, the contemporaries, but we believe something else. The negative counterpart to that positive idea. The negative counterpart is, it's not that these institutions of property of the liberal state are part of the definition of freedom. It's rather that any attempt to replace them by something else destroys freedom. So it's that negative, defensive, and residual idea which exercises the causal primacy. And that's why these arguments that I'm proposing to you about the institutional alternatives for the economy and for politics are so important. So a high-energy democracy would be a democracy that is organized in a way that actively refuses to accept the perpetuation of the class order and is fertile in initiatives that subvert it. That's the first test. The first criterion for distinguishing a weak democracy from a high-energy democracy. The second criterion has to do with the dependence of transformation, including these transformations that would subvert the class order, on crisis. So a weak democracy, as I'm saying all the existing democracies are, to one or another extent, is a democracy that needs crisis to make change possible. It's a democracy in which the rule is no trauma, no transformation. And crisis in this form that is hospitable to structural change has come in two main forms. One form is economic collapse, ruin, and the other form is war. So you could say, the more change depends on crisis, the weaker the democracy is. It's a criterion of its weakness. A criterion of the strengthening of democracy, of the creation of a high-energy democracy, is that it does not need or needs less crisis as the enabling circumstance of change. So then there would be certain institutional innovations that would diminish the dependence of change on crisis. For example, arrangements that facilitated constitutional revision or amendment in the absence of crisis. But of course, there's a circularity of the following nature. The rules or the institutions that would diminish the dependence of change on crisis seem to themselves depend for their instauration on crisis. It's that circularity that would have to be broken. And one of the ways in which it might be broken is through the imagination in politics. And then one could say, the task of the imagination in politics, of the imagination carried by political prophets and social movements with a prophetic character, is to do the work of crisis without crisis. And this idea has come up at several points in the argument, as in my reference to a war economy without a war, as part of what one might want. Massive mobilization of resources, as in a war economy, and radical institutional change in the management of the economy. The combination of large-scale resource mobilization with radical institutional experimentation. So that's the second criterion of a high-energy democracy. The first criterion is it creates trouble for the class order, and the second criterion is it weakens the dependence of change on crisis. The third criterion is it attenuates the power of path dependency, the power of the past to depend, to shape the future. The societies of the world are, as it were, in orbits, in fixed orbits. And a high-energy democracy would be a democracy that can knock itself out of these orbits, with the result that in a high-energy democracy in which the power of the past to shape the future is diminished, not annulled, but diminished, we could say that we are able to overthrow the rule of the living by the dead. These are the three criteria of a high-energy democracy. What I mean by a high-energy democracy. Now, there's a kind of rhetorical paradox in the nature of this argument that I want to acknowledge. In placing the starting points of the argument in relation to those two debates, the ideological debate about the freedom of the moderns and the freedom of the ancients, and the debate about the institutions, the inner circle rather than the outer circle, and I said, we have to start with the inner circle because that's the only thing that's real. I seem to take the conservative position. And now, in defining a high-energy democracy and contrasting it to the flawed, weak, low-energy democracies, I seem to be taking it all back by emphasizing the transformative ambition. I don't think this is a contradiction. I think this is the acknowledgement of a tension in which I'm saying that the transformative ambition is radical, but the starting point has to be the real starting point of history. And the situation that we are delivered by history, we have no alternative to that. But having accepted that starting point, we can, again, take it as the point of departure rather than as the point of arrival, and we can have this project. So, which would say, we will create a democracy that will create trouble for the class order, that will diminish the dependence of change on crisis, and that will weaken, if it cannot annul, the power of path dependency. Now let me stop there for a moment and ask whether someone would like to make a comment or ask a question about these initial propositions. Because from here I then begin the exploration of the institutional alternatives.
Professor, what do you mean by increase participation? Like, it is
Increase
not
what?
participation, like
You
in
mean by
public
you're thinking
affairs.
what part of my remarks? The part about describing the...
Yeah, more
Yes, yes.
freedom is more participation in public affairs and public discussions, public life.
So in that ideological contrast of Benjamin Constant, the idea is, for the ancients, politics is not an exceptional activity. Politics is the central activity. There's the experience of agency, of acting in the world, of turning the tables on your circumstance, is an experience that is necessarily shared. It's a collective experience, not an individual experience. And it's, according to that view of the freedom of the ancients, it's the central activity. It penetrates all of life, as a religion does. Because one of the characteristics of a religion is that it demands to penetrate everything, all domains of life. From that standpoint, the middle period of the history of Protestantism, which has such a large influence in the United States because the background of the constitutional and political ideas, is an exception in the history of religion, because it was a period in which exceptionally religion was privatized and regarded as a concern of the individual, the internal conscience. But this is the opposite. So agency, real agency, always exists in this collective and political form, according to that idea. So that's what participation means in that context. And therefore participation is contrasted to this activity of the incarnate individual, the flesh and bones individual, who has private interest and attends to his private interest first. And the affairs of the republic come later. That's what it's being contrasted to. Yes.
I just want to understand in terms of the independence from crisis in pushing for change. There exist political and governmental structures which allow for such change without necessitating crisis in many democracies around the world. I'm thinking of Sweden in particular with its moderately easy constitutional amendment process. Is the argument that societally the push for change is necessitated by crisis, or that the actual institutional change can only come about after a period of crisis?
Well, there are variations among the existing democracies in the difficulty of the amendment process. So in the United States, the amendment of the Constitution is exceptionally difficult. And that helps explain why in the United States, the dominant way of reinterpreting the Constitution, of changing the Constitution, is to reinterpret it rather than to amend it. In many other countries, it's not so difficult. Nevertheless, with respect to the level of structural ambition, the use of the laws and of the Constitution to reorganize the economic order, for example, it doesn't happen. It happens very rarely. It happens in a very limited form. And transformation is typically enabled by trauma. Now, is that natural? Or is that something that we can modify? Is that a constant or is it a variable? It's like the argument about path dependency. Is path dependency a constant or is it a variable? The power that the past has over the future. Here I'm anticipating the claim, the idea that it's a variable, it's not a constant. That's the notion. Regardless of whether the amendment process, the amendment of the Constitution narrowly conceived is very difficult or not. Yes.
So, Professor, I have a doubt on the third criteria that you explained, in the sense that when we look, for example, on democratic backsliding, we see that what Professor Levitsky called institutional hardballing is often what leads to this erosion. So when we say that we should try to move past the influence of the past that is often reflected into these institutions, how can we balance it out to ensure that we are not fostering something like Viktor Orban back in the courts to really push
How
toward...
can you say that again?
How can we balance it out to avoid persons like Viktor Orban on Hungary back in the courts to really push forward their vision of power and not a democratic vision?
Of course. I mean, this is always the argument of conservative liberalism, the fear that change will be captured by demagogues and so forth. That the democratic thesis is that the dangers of democracy are cured with more democracy, the dangers of debate with more debate, and so forth. The problem in Hungary is not that the people are too politicized, according to this view, it's that they're not politicized enough, and so forth. So, but so there's no perpetual motion machine that can guarantee us. So the conservative liberal belief is these liberal institutions are an insurance policy against the worst happening. And philosophically, they are recommended, they are defended as being the impersonal order of right, in contrast to the sectarian good, so that people with different religions, different philosophies can live within the same liberal framework. Now, the objection, the response is that this idea of neutrality is false. Because every institutional framework tilts the scales in favor of some forms of human experience or existence against others. And that the false liberal ideal of neutrality nevertheless has a kinship to a legitimate idea, which is that although no order can be neutral among conflicting conceptions of the good, one order can be more capacious and inclusive of contradictory experience. And one order can be more susceptible to self-transformation. It can facilitate its own revision. It can be corrigible in the light of experience. So I would say inclusiveness or contradiction and corrigibility are the legitimate counterparts to the illegitimate idea of neutrality. So the thesis of conservative liberalism to which you referred is this thesis that we can somehow escape the storms of history by having a set of institutions which is neutral, which is impersonal. And the response is we can't escape the storms of history. They will come back to us in another form because we will have instituted a sectarian order. What we should legitimately want is to have an order that's open to a wide range of contradictory experience, although not all experience, and although not neutral, and that above all can be corrected. That's what we should want. And then the issue is, under what circumstances are we more or less likely to be able to correct them? Now, taking the example of the United States, which admittedly is an extreme example because of the cult of the Constitution in the United States, I observed in our classes about the United States that Franklin Roosevelt, who was the leading reformer in the 20th century, had as his allies the greatest economic collapse in modern history and the greatest war in all of history, the Second World War. And even then he had trouble because the laws in the Constitution were designed to give him trouble. So I say, our freedom does not depend or should not depend on tying our hands to that extent. We should not be paralyzed in order to be free. Now, of course, the opposing thesis that we shouldn't buy this insurance policy because its price is too high. Nevertheless has dangers. It doesn't guarantee us that in opening ourselves to the storm of history, we'll make the right choices. Because it says the people should be educated. The only way to educate the people politically is to give them more politics, not less politics. They may nevertheless make the wrong choice. They may take the wrong side. And the important thing is that having made a choice which may be ruinous, they be able to escape that choice later on. So that's the argument. It's obviously an argument which is not resolved, but those at least are the terms of the argument. So then I want to argue that there are 5 sets of institutional innovations that would give content to the idea of a high-energy democracy. Some of them I anticipate in the discussion of the United States, but now let me go back over all of them systematically. So the first set of institutional innovations, and before I do that, let me say, all of the innovations that I'm going to describe are not radical inventions that came from Mars. They are extensions of things that already exist in the contemporary world and that are debated in the contemporary world. It's the particular way of combining them which produces the transformative effect. So the first set of innovations has to do with the elevation of the temperature of politics. What I mean by the temperature of politics is the level of popular mobilization, popular engagement in political life. A high temperature politics is a politics with a high degree of organized popular political engagement. When we discussed the United States, I said, the premise of conservative political science and conservative statecraft is that there is an inverse relation between political participation, political mobilization, and political institutionalization. Mobilization is always relative to a certain level of institutionalization. So a conservative political scientist like, say, Samuel Huntington has the thesis that there's a certain level of political engagement, of popular political engagement, that is compatible with institutionalization. And that then leads to the notion that at the end of the day, we have to choose, I said before, between Madison and Mussolini. We have to choose between a politics that is institutional but cold and a politics that is anti-institutional and hot. So the anti-institutional form is described by conservative political science as Caesarism. It's a populist, personalist leadership of the masses outside and against the institutions. And the alternative to that is institutional life, in which politics has a cool, deliberative tone, as opposed to this intense, heated, mobilizational tone. And the claim underlying this first set of proposals is that that opposition is false. That's a false dilemma. Politics can be hot and institutional at the same time. And different sets of institutions can differ in the degree to which they sustain a high level of popular mobilization. That's the crucial argument. Now, on what then does it depend? And here, it doesn't depend on one big thing, one silver bullet. It depends on the combined and cumulative effect of a number of arrangements. So some of these arrangements can be rules about the financing of politics, constraints on the use of money, of private money, and the availability of public money to finance political activity. 2, the access to the means of mass communication. So, for example, are the media companies, like the media companies that run television, are they required to distribute television time for free to the political parties and the social and the organized social movements as a condition for holding their revocable licenses under which they do their business? And in many contemporary societies, there are such rules. In many democracies around the world, television time cannot be bought. 3rd, the rules of voting. So, for example, is the vote optional or mandatory? And again, in many countries, both developing and rich countries, the vote is mandatory. Understand what that means. What that means is not that a policeman comes to the voter's home and drags the voter to the voting booth. What it means is that you're required to vote. If you don't vote, you pay a small fine. It's not a criminal offense. It's an administrative or civil offense. And in no country, in no democracy that has adopted a rule of mandatory voting, and there are many, has this rule ever been revoked later. So what has happened, the empirical experience is that the rule of mandatory voting helps form a collective habit, and the habit is then self-sustaining. Of course, in countries that are very unequal and that have a rule of mandatory voting, there is persistent agitation by the conservatives in politics to abolish mandatory voting. And they argue that the mandatory voting results in the ignorant part, the uneducated parts of the population coming and voting and being manipulated in the process of their political participation. And then, so in the United States, you know, half of the electorate votes, typically in national elections. The rule of mandatory voting would have radical effects. But the initial reaction of Americans to the proposal of a rule of mandatory voting is it's coercive. Now, why do they think that? They have jury duty. They have declaratory taxes, like the income tax, which require them to spend a lot of time to perform their legal obligation. And of course, they can have the draft at times of war. So the rule of mandatory voting is simply requiring them to spend a few moments every few years turning their minds to the affairs of the republic. They can go to the voting booth and abstain. An abstention under a system of mandatory voting has a very different meaning from the meaning that it has under a system of optional voting. So, for example, in Argentina, there was an election in which the military prevented the Peronist candidate from running. So a majority of the population required to vote by the rule of mandatory voting went to the voting booth and abstained. And that has a dramatic effect on delegitimizing the electoral result. Under rule of optional voting, the meaning of abstention is completely ambiguous because it can be and often is interpreted as meaning everything's okay. So I don't feel the need to vote. It's not a expressive denunciation of the political order. And finally, voting regimes, which I think have purely circumstantial effects. Proportional representation, first past the post-voting. The effect depends on the history, on the particular context. So in one society, proportional representation can have a mobilizing effect. In another society, it can be the opposite. Now, all of this is relevant to the question of whether a low level of political mobilization is somehow a cultural destiny, a cultural fact. You can say, in this society, the people aren't interested in politics. But you could say that in the United States. But I can say, give me some of these rules that I've mentioned. Give me a rule of mandatory voting. Give me prohibition of the sale of television time. Give me public financing of political activity. And I'll show you that the Americans will be intensely politicized in a relatively short period of time. So the fundamental idea, the thesis is a political life that is fertile in structural change, in proposals of structural change, in transformative ambition, especially or including ambition to defy the class system, to subvert it, is necessarily a high-temperature politics. Now we come to the second set of innovations. The second set of innovations is hastening the pace of politics. And hastening the pace of politics by dissolving impasse as quickly as possible through the engagement of the general electorate. So it's like Karl Popper's observation about science. He said, the point in science is to make mistakes as quickly as possible. He'd say this is the political counterpart to that idea. To accelerate the tempo of politics. Now it's very clear what that means under a system of divided government like the United States, which there are two separate political branches, the executive and the Congress. What it means is that if there's a stalemate between them, the stalemate will be resolved quickly. And I suggested a way in which it could be resolved quickly. either by comprehensive programmatic plebiscites and referenda, not single issue plebiscites, but plebiscites about the alternative directions proposed in the two branches, or by anticipated elections. And either of the political branches could unilaterally call anticipated elections, but the elections would always be bilateral for both branches, so that the branch that exercised the constitutional prerogative would have to pay the political price of running the electoral risk. And my supposition is that under such a system, the prerogative would be exercised too rarely rather than too often, because of the political price that would have to be paid. The politicians subjecting themselves to the risk of re-election. So now we can formulate the same idea in more abstract terms. There are two architectural principles in the American constitutional scheme. There's a liberal principle of the fragmentation of power, and there's a conservative principle of the slowing down of politics, which was Madison's scheme of checks and balances. And what we would want to do toward the aim of a high-energy democracy would be to reaffirm the liberal principle, but to repudiate the conservative one. And we would do it by one of these devices that I just mentioned, like allowing either of the political branches to dissolve the impasse by calling early elections. Now come the third set of innovations. The third set of innovations are innovations that would try to combine a facility for decisive action by the central government with the ability of parts of the country, territorial parts like states or provinces, or sectoral parts, to secede from the general solutions, the dominant national solution, and to create alternatives, counter models of the national future. Because after all, for an alternative to be powerful, it can't just be a doctrine, an idea, a proposal. It has to be embodied in an example. And I imagine that this creation of a kind of dialectic in the country, of the dominant solution and a set of alternatives presented to the society, could occur taking advantage of the experimentalist potential of a federal system. When there is a federal system in federal states. And this experimentalist use of the relation between the center and the periphery could go through two stages. In the first stage, the emphasis would be on cooperation. Now, there are two kinds of cooperation. There's vertical cooperation within a federation, among the three levels of the federation. And there is horizontal cooperation among the states or among the municipalities in a certain region. So cooperation is the initial form of this experimentalism. And we see this in many societies, in India, in the United States, in Brazil. In the United States, all of the governors, Republicans as well as Democrats, are experimenting with industrial policies. Many of them are trying to have their little Silicon Valleys, and they're organized regionally, like the Western governors are organized regionally. And these regional policies established through horizontal cooperation are typically used to promote alternative development strategies. So the creation of an alternative, of a knowledge economy for the many, or of an alternative system of national education, are very appropriate for vertical cooperation. And a regional development strategy is appropriate for horizontal cooperation. Now, in a second stage, this device can evolve towards what I would call wide divergence, and I'll explain the idea. So wide divergence, as you say, it's not just that different parts of the country are cooperating to generate alternatives. A particular part of the country applies for a right of diverging very widely from the dominant solutions. Of course, this exercise of wide divergence has to be vetted both politically and judicially so that it not be an instrument of abuse, of discrimination, of exclusion, of privilege, as it was in American history. But once vetted, the idea is, it is in the interest of the country to allow a part of the society that wants to embark on a very widely diverging experiment. Now, wide divergence is not necessarily restricted to federations. You could say that a unitary state, a state which has no political division among federated states or municipalities, has an advantage. Because in a unitary state, there is no presumption that all parts of the country must enjoy at the same time the same level of divergence. So the United Kingdom may, for example, make a deal with Scotland that's different from the deal that it makes with Wales or with England. The whole premise of wide divergence is that the degree of divergence doesn't have to be uniform throughout the country at the same time. And the whole idea is then to avoid having to embark on a dogmatic adhesion to a single formula throughout the country, and to create a dialectic of alternatives, alternative forms of vanguardism, of the knowledge economy, or of the alternative educational system, and to try it out. Any remark or question about that? So the fourth set of innovations now would have to do with the problem of the class order, the relation of democracy to the class order. And in particular with the following issue, which is the existence of a form of disadvantage or exclusion in the society, which is obviously structural, but at the same time localized, either spatially or socially. So imagine that there is a group that is unable to escape from the circumstances of social exclusion or disadvantage by the forms of collective action that are available to it. It can't escape. So it's possible for there to be a form of disempowerment that is localized in a particular part of the country or of the society, and that imposes a burden of disadvantage or exclusion which its victims are unable to escape, to overcome. The contemporary state, democratic state, these low energy democracies, these weak democracies that exist in the world, has no device by which to do that. The state should be organized to have a part of it that can come to the rescue of those groups and change the organizations, the rules, the practices in a particular part of society and liberate the groups. Now, this is not such a strange thing as may first appear. So, in the United States, this activity of a form of intervention that is structural but localized was in fact undertaken under the label of the structural injunctions or of complex enforcement by the judges, especially the federal judges, in a period in which the progressives had hegemony in the composition of the federal judiciary. So they then developed these procedural devices, which then said a certain organization, a school system, or it could be a mental hospital, a network of mental hospitals, or a network of prisons, is imposing on part of the population a burden, an insult from which that part of the population cannot escape, and which is in contradiction to the large ideals imputed to the law. Now, no part of the government as organized was appropriate to do this. No part had the resources, the practical ability, or the legitimacy to undertake this work. So in the United States, the federal judiciary did it. Why did it do it? Because it wanted to do it. It did it until it ran out of power. So it did it with relatively marginal institutions like insane asylums or prisons, rather than with the central institutions of the economy. They could get away doing it with the prisons or the insane asylums, but presumably they wouldn't be allowed to do it with the banks. In a parliamentary system with undivided government, it couldn't possibly be done by the judges. It would have to be done by a delegated part of the legislature. And eventually, say, if the state is to do this work of structural transformation that is localized rather than generalized in the form of general rules. It needs to be specially chosen for that purpose and organized for that purpose and resourced for that purpose. So this would be a way of beginning this undone work of defying the class system. Now, what has in fact happened in the history of the 20th century constitutions? The two devices that have been prominent in the 20th century to govern the relation of democracy to the class order have been corporatism in the first half of the 20th century and social rights in the second half of the 20th century. And let me say a word about each of them. So corporatism was a doctrine and a procedure especially associated with European fascism, but also with the left. So, for example, in Guild socialism. And corporatism was an attempt to say, given that there is a class order, which in principle contradicts democracy and contradicts the Republican principle, we should attempt to master this class order by procedures that emphasize cooperation and co-option. We should represent the different classes in the state and create these para-state or quasi-state organizations for the representation of the class order. We won't be able to subvert the class order. We may not even want to. But we will be able to govern it and prevent its abuses and its perversions. So in the mid-20th century, corporatism influenced governments throughout the world, including Franklin Roosevelt in the United States, and the social doctrines of the Catholic Church. In the late 19th century, the papal encyclicals emphasized just rights, with no institutional machinery to make the promises of rights real. And in the period, encyclical Rerum Novarum in 1891, in the interwar encyclicals, especially in Quadragesimo Anno, 1931, 40 years after Rerum Novarum, the Church, for the first and only time, committed itself to a particular institutional program, and it was the program of corporatism. Forming organizations in which capitalists and workers would be co-represented in the same organizations, and they would establish a strategy of class compromise so that the class conflict would be suppressed or smothered in this atmosphere of consensus and cooperation. The Church then later abandoned this proposal, and in the encyclicals beginning in the late 20th century, reverted to the same position it had in the late 19th century, which is promises of social rights or defense of social rights without any institutional machinery, because it was shocked by the, by the association with the discredited instruments of corporatism, discredited by its association with fascism, and viewed as a form of simple submission to the class order rather than transformation of it. So corporatism must be judged a failure, and it was rejected. And then what happened later in the second half of the 20th century? That's what I want to call Weimarism, because it was something that was initiated by the Weimar Constitution immediately after the First World War. But it only became dominant in the world in the second half of the 20th century. Weimarism had two parts. One part had to do with the setup of the government. It's what you could call constitutional dualism. So the idea was there'd be two connections of the government with the people. There would be the direct election of a president with a strong popular mandate, and there would be a government, a sitting government and a prime minister, accountable both to the president and to the parliament. So there would be two forms of connection between government and people. One presidential and the other parliamentary. And the attempt was to give the state mobility, efficacy, capacity to act, but at the same time to strengthen its connection with society. In many societies, it produced some kind of semi-political paralysis. And in Germany, where Weimarism began, its political logic was redirected through the introduction of a state of exception or emergency associated with Carl Schmitt. So that's the first part of what I'm calling Weimar. The second part is the part that has had a fabulous career throughout the world. The second part is that the constitutions of the whole world began to be filled up with promises of rights, promising the sky to the people. Everything you can imagine is in these constitutions. You don't know it in the United States because the American Constitution exceptionally followed the advice of Napoleon Bonaparte, that the Constitution should be brief and obscure. So the rest of the world didn't follow this advice and embarked on this Weimarism. So in these constitutions, like the Constitution of India, the Constitution of Brazil, it has hundreds of promises of rights, everything. You're going to have a wonderful education, you're going to have housing guaranteed, you're going to have, they're going to take care of you in old age and when you're a baby and so on and so forth. Absolutely no reality, because these promises of rights are completely unkept. There's no institutional machinery to execute them. So that's the situation now in the second half of the 20th century and at the beginning of the 21st century. So the fourth set of innovations that I mentioned of the antidote to the structural disadvantage that is localized is a way of beginning to create the institutional and procedural machinery that could deal with the problem and begin to attack the class order, at least at its periphery, in its manifestations of extreme disadvantage in the society. Now, finally, the fifth set of innovations are innovations that, without accepting the historical premise of the left of repudiating representative democracy and replacing it with direct democracy, superimposes on the institutions of representative democracy elements of direct democracy. Now, I have to say, the most significant way of effacing the radical contrast between representative democracy and direct democracy is nothing about constitutions. It's about the general organization of the society and its economy. So it's no good to offer an illusion or a promise of popular self-government if the actual form of economic organization is the denial of that. So a knowledge economy for the many would give the masses, the popular majority, the experience of effacing the contrast between supervision and execution. Direct participation in the governance of their practical affairs. But you can imagine ways in which it can also be relevant to the organization of politics. So from the top down or from the bottom up? From the top down, it's by increasing the role of comprehensive programmatic plebiscites or referenda about the direction of the society. And from the bottom up, it's by popular participation at the local level. For example, a network of neighborhood associations that would be parallel to the structures of local government, and that organized government in the locality at the grassroots in dialogue with the citizens. So I would say these 5 sets of innovations that I've just outlined would be the instrument for affirming that contrast between high-energy democracy and the weak, low-level democracies that exist. Now, I think what's interesting is that the content of these proposals is actually quite conventional. There's almost nothing in these proposals other than maybe the ideas about cooperative federalism and experimental federalism that goes far beyond ideas and arrangements that are debated and implemented in the world today. But it's the way of combining them in a certain direction that then affirms the distinction. I want to say one more thing by way of concluding this discussion. So, what's the general idea that animates all of this? I can explain it by a metaphor. And the metaphor is one that I've used once before in the arguments, the metaphor of the haven and the storm. So the conception is the individual has a haven that protects him so that he can be unafraid and empowered. It's this haven of rights. and of rights, not just private rights in the economy, but the public rights of participation in this world in which the present is not dominated by the past, politics is not dominated by the class order, and transformation does not depend on trauma. But the haven is not enough to make the citizen free. There has to be a storm. Because if society is not open to conflict, to revision, to experiment, to innovation, the individual is not free. He's then the oppressed subject of this structure which is imposed on him by history. So social democracy and its liberalized form, social liberalism, are all about the haven. But where's the storm? The storm doesn't arise spontaneously. The only way in which the storm can arise spontaneously is by ruin or by war. And that's why in these 20th century experiments in renovation, war and economic collapse have been so decisive. The storm, if it's not to be war or ruin, has to be arranged. It's not something that's going to happen automatically. And the way to arrange it is to create a high energy democracy, a high temperature and high energy democracy, an experimental, innovation-oriented economy for the majority, for the mass. So many or most of the arguments that I'm presenting, that I'm exploring with you, could be characterized as the organization of the storm. Not waiting for history to provide the storm, but providing the storm ourselves. Well, that's what I wanted to say. So you've seen that most of the course up to now has been about the reorganization of the economy. And it's natural that it should be, because that's the stuff of practical life. Given the predominance of the freedom of the moderns, the flesh and bones individual concerned with his everyday affairs, it's natural so that the first concern should be the organization of daily life, and thus the reordering of the economy. But then the question becomes, from where does the new come? If not just from culture and its abstractions. The new comes from this interaction between the storm and the haven, between the individual, empowered, enhanced, fearless, and the bubbling up of alternatives in social and cultural life. Well, that's all I wanted to say by way of the program of high energy democracy. Now ask me questions. Yes.
So I'd like us to go back briefly to the third criterion, which is about the creation of territorial or sectoral experimental alternatives.
Yes.
one could say that this is very much the reality of today. Many states have created the so-called social, special economic zones, which provide for certain benefits for, especially in particular for foreign investors. I understand that there is a constituency on the far right who wants to push this agenda further. I'm thinking about Peter Thiel and his idea of startup nations. And in fact, I've been reading that there is lobbying
Now,
these days.
Go more slowly and speak more loudly.
Yes. So there is a constituency on the far right who wants to take this idea of experimentation with secession even further. There is Peter Thiel and his idea of startup nations. There is lobbying today in front of the US Congress for creation of so-called freedom cities.
Yes.
Again, this pertains, the proposals there are simple. Let's just deregulate
Yes.
so that established businesses can
Yes.
reap more benefits. So the question is then, how do we ensure that we can use this toolkit of territorial and sectoral experimentation in a democratic way, or in the service of empowered democracy? One thing that you've mentioned has been the idea of vetting these projects. So could you specify what this process of vetting could involve in more detail?
So first of all, let me say this. And this is really very important because it applies to the whole argument that I've been developing. There's a huge amount of experimentation in the world today. There's this kind of Brownian motion, to use the physical metaphor, of below. So if you look above at the great states, at the ideologies, it could seem uniform. But that's not what the world is like. Down below, there's this huge amount of movement. And that's the background of some of the phenomena to which you refer. And so, I'm trying to hook on to that. I mean, that's the fuel on which I'm drawing. So I'm not saying there's nothing in the world that could underlie this. There's an immense amount in the world, but we have to understand and engage with it and have a structure that engage with it. So that's the spirit. So otherwise, we'd be back to the problem that I cited in the first day of class, right? In which I say, here's a future, and you say, well, that's beautiful, but it's utopian. Or I say, here's something concrete, and you say, well, that already exists. The false dilemma of the trivial and the utopian. So I think that this Brownian motion exists, but it's not expressed and translated into these large programs, into these projects. And the emphasis of the center-left ideologies has been this emphasis of humanization, right? It hasn't been energy, innovation, the interpretation of the new. Now, the question is, a lot of this bubbling could take perverse directions. And we know from the history of these societies that in the past, many of these experiments in cooperative federalism, for example, have been perverted. So the vetting to which I referred was that. So if you take, in the case, an egregious example is American history, where different secessionist ideas of withdrawal from the dominant solutions have been used as devices of oppression. So it has to be judged. Politically, I say, by the political institutions, is it serving an oppressive or exclusive cause? And by the legal elites, the judicial elites, to determine whether it passes some legal and constitutional muster, whether it passes the threshold of not being a new form of exclusion or oppression. That's the idea. That the Brownian motion has to be received with enthusiasm, but also with discrimination, with selection. We have to have criteria to distinguish when it passes a red line and passes into the terrain of instituting some new form of injustice. That was the idea. So let me ask you a positive question. What advice do you give me for the development of these ideas in a way that would make them more powerful? Yes.
I guess this isn't necessarily advice, but one thing that I've been researching is like the collective action problem and the difficulty of getting people involved in social movements and political mobilization. Obviously, the idea of mandatory voting would, overcome the fact that people see very little benefit to choosing to vote and so choose to stay home on election day, right? But I guess I'm wondering how you propose continuing to involve a person and motivate them to participate politically, because a situation like mandatory voting could actually serve as like a substitute rather than a continued motivation, right? So someone decides to vote, they check the box, they go to the polls or whatever, and they think their civic duty is done, or they've conducted like the minimum requirement to stay a citizen or something like that. So how do we motivate them to continue participating beyond the bare minimum?
I think that what has primacy is collective psychology in the light of common experience. So if the common experience of the individual is the experience of either working alone as an individual agent or working in a command and control organization like Fordist mass production, that experience will give the lie to the promises of this kind of politics. So the most important lessons learned are the lessons of everyday experience. It's no good having a doctrine and having that doctrine expressed in the narrow theater of political life, but then the day-to-day experience of the individual tells the opposite. So to my mind, the decisive thing is the relation of the political experience to this day-to-day life. And that's another reason why I say the transformation of politics should not come first. What should come first should be the redirection of the economy. And that's what's decisive. Yes.
I don't know what the solution to this is, but one of the things that jumps out to me about the modern experience of American politics that I don't see a solution to in your five is something about shared truth and the epistemology for understanding what's going on in the world. Because even if you change some of the institutions to break impasse, if we're so polarized that there's blocks of disagreement, I'm not confident that we're going to really create this high energy democracy beyond maybe some pockets at the local level.
But say a little bit more. So what's the implication then?
So the implication is a kind of general disagreement about what direction to go, that I think even if you make some institutional changes, there's just this hard bifurcation of politics in America that has something to do with, media bubbles and the fragmentation of understanding of the world on social media that just disconnects people from kind of civically engaging in a way that I feel like was taken for granted in a lot of 19th and 20th century philosophy.
But what's the solution? It seems to be the solution to the defects of politics is more politics. It's like the solution to the defects of television is more television. And so isn't that the case? I mean, because otherwise we have this idea, the liberal idea of neutrality to which I referred, which I can't believe. I think it's false. And the alternative to it is contradiction and corrigibility.
I'm not saying I have a solution, but I just felt like when you started talking about like the access to the means of mass communication, I think there's something more to build out that takes account of the way that the political media has transformed in the 21st century.
Yes. But you think by examining the social media and its consequences, we could form ideas about what to do with it? I mean, because you don't want to say, right, that it's just a fate. It's a phenomenon that happens, and we don't know what to do with it. We have a problem, so let's deal with it, and by understanding it and extending the range of possible institutional responses will always be good, because it will give us a sense that there are alternatives. And then we'll be able to think piece by piece, step by step. So I think that part of the thing that makes me so uncomfortable with